So today we're really pleased to bring you Mark to explore the drivers of economic growth that is happening in Springfield and provides insights into the future of Springfield and what the wider region holds. So please join me in welcoming Mark Wallace.
Thank you so much. Excellent lapel. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I walk around a lot, so this doesn't necessarily always work very well. Thank you so much for having me here today, and thank you so much for the kind remarks and the welcome. I have had the pleasure and privilege of working in and around the Springfield area for the last more than a decade, 12 years now, and have been involved in projects including the hospital and the business cases with MARTA, the original attraction of the radiation oncology work there, in and around with the university, as well as major road, retail, commercial, transport projects. It's been really diverse. And one of the things that I've noticed from working for such a long period of time with Springfield City Group and in the Springfield region is when I compare that to my other work around the country, where I'm working in other growth areas like the Northwest Corridor of Perth, in Joondalup and Alkimos, or in places like the Hume Corridor in Melbourne, or the Greater Dandenong region, or even the corridor from Parramatta to Penrith in Western Sydney. When you're looking at these areas, one of the things that dawns on me and really strikes me about Springfield is the diversity of drivers of growth in the Springfield region. There's a lot of growth happening in a lot of places around the country, and one of the things that when you look at and start digging deeper into the drivers of growth of other areas is often they're one-trick ponies. It's all about population growth, or there's one economic asset upon which all the economic activity is based. And that's great when that's the thing that is hot. But when it's not, it all falls over. Diversity of growth and diversity of drivers of growth is really, really important to sustaining long-term economic prosperity. And the other thing that's really interesting about having a diversity of drivers is that it doesn't happen by accident. It's not something that you can simply, wish into being or have it happen organically as you go along. What ends up happening if you're developing areas or a location organically is it usually specializes in one thing, population growth or a certain asset, like I mentioned before. But what you have to do to have a diversity of growth is it has to be by design. And that's one of the interesting things about the Springfield project is that single landholder with a long-term vision and a vision for a multi-purpose, multi-land use style of community. Because if you look in other parts of Southeast Queensland, there's lots of really, really strong growing residential communities, but they don't necessarily have the jobs. Or the jobs that are there are in the retail space or things servicing the direct population. And so what happens to people in those communities? They hop in their car and they drive away for jobs. And there's nothing wrong with that. You're always going to get a certain number of people driving away, but you also want them to come back. People coming to your area for jobs as well. Just quickly in terms of Econisis, it is our 1-year anniversary today. So thank you so much for the opportunity to celebrate that with you. What I've been very fortunate to work with Springfield City Group over the last 12 years has been on a real diversity of projects, but also of offerings and the types of work. So there's a lot of work around the demographics and what is the nature of the population growth, but also its age profile, its skills, the socioeconomic drivers, because it's those qualitative elements that have as much of an impact when it comes to the future, economic activity of the region as it is just the sheer number of people. And we've also tried to look outside of the boundaries of the project as well, because one of the things that we know, and when we look at things like this Shaping SEQ regional plan, or we just look at the way of which people and expenditure flows in and out of Springfield, is that Springfield has become the capital of this region. And that we have high growth areas in through Greenbank and down to Flagstone, through to Ripley, and even increasing population intensification in through back into Brisbane, all of which is creating this larger secondary catchment of population that is increasingly reliant and dependent on Springfield for its growth. And that's why you're seeing things such as the hospital investment, the university, these higher end tertiary facilities. That's not because of Springfield and its population, that's because of Springfield and its population and the population that's around it in that secondary catchment. And so when drawing upon that demographic analysis, we also draw upon a lot of other different data sets and a lot of different types of economic assessments to support investment decision-making and other types of project proposals. In terms of growth, I mentioned before that you want a diversity of growth, and there's a range of different things that drive the growth of an urban environment. Lifestyle is often a really big one. If you look at the way in which Australia has been settled and now urban development pattern, it's followed the coastline. And there's a reason for that, is because of the inherent nature of the environment and the attractiveness of that. The problem with that is that the carrying capacity of the environment is inherently capped. And there's a lot of places around the coastlines of Australia that have not built amenity. They've just relied on a natural amenity, and that's limited. And eventually what happens is that livability becomes a commodity that drives prices through the roof. It becomes more and more constrained. And that's because we need to invest in amenities and facilities and services to improve the capacity, the carrying capacity of that amenity. There's also major pieces of catalytic infrastructure that are really, really important. So when you're talking about things like airports and mines and all of these types of things, when you look at where our economic activity around the country is, often you'll find these big mega projects that are driving economic activity. But again, if something turns against that commodity or against that travel route or against where the major travel patterns are, such as, for example, a global pandemic, then things can turn really south really, really quickly. So as an urban area, you want to have three really key drivers that will ultimately determine the success of the prosperity you're trying to achieve within an urban region. You want population growth, but it's the quality of the population growth, not just the quantum of it. Because you want a young and engaged population that's wanting to be economically and socially integrated into the community and be participating into the community, because that builds a level of vibrancy and dynamism that is really, really important to pushing prosperity and growth into the future. You want them engaged in the economy, high levels of employment, high levels of business creation, and you want a skills profile in that population to make you attractive to inward investment and new business growth. And that's a really important distinction, because when you look at other places around the country where there has been rapid population growth, often it's a homogenous population from a labour force pool. It doesn't offer the diversity of skills, and it often doesn't offer the capacity within that economy or that location to build more skills, i.e. TAFEs and universities. And so when you have that lack of diversity, again, you're not as attractive as a destination for investment. And so having not only the population with favourable demographics, but having that population being skilled and economically engaged is a critical driver. And finally, and honestly, probably the most important part is having a dynamic business community. There's some great work that has been done by the Australian Bureau of Agriculture and Resource Economics at a national level for a number of years now, tracking farm failures. When do farms fail? And they've gone through and done all the analysis of all the drivers, droughts and floods and commodity price changes. And the number one thing they can say that determines whether a farm will fail or succeed is the business acumen of the manager. That's the only consistent driver. In fact, there are farms right next to one another. One fails and one booms, and it has nothing to do with the environment or the commodity. It is the acumen, the dynamism, the investment emotionally and in terms of their effort of the business manager. And the same thing applies to business communities when we talk about local economies. The distinction between two different regions that might look exactly the same economically, one of which is booming and one of which is not, is because of the level of integration, collaboration, competition, and general dynamism within the business community. When you do that, and you have economic assets wrapped around economic assets, that's when you start getting an economic windfall for the community. So let's talk specifically about Springfield and where it has been and where it's going, because it's a really interesting story, and it's a story that I get asked about a lot outside of Queensland. So it's something to be aware of. It's very hard when you're in a place to necessarily have the perspective, but as somebody who writes a lot of case studies about Springfield for other governments and other agencies around the country, just know that the story that is happening here and has happened here and will happen here is a story that resonates with a lot of people. I hope you like charts. So the story of a population that has gone from 3,000 people to 40,000 people within the project area over the last 20 years. That's your headline figure. That's a phenomenal growth rate. Just in the last 10 years alone, it is almost 7% per annum, year-on-year growth. That's a phenomenal growth rate for any location. It is more than 4 times that of the state and national averages. So what that means is that when somebody comes to Queensland, for example, the 100,000 additional people we got in Queensland in the year to June 2022, there's a disproportionate share of those people that pick Springfield as their place of residence. When somebody leaves home from outside in the southern Brisbane area, they're leaving home, they're going to university, they're looking for a job. Where are they going? Well, there's a big portion of that population that is coming down the Centenary Highway from the inner Brisbane suburbs and choosing Springfield. When people are reaching their empty nester or retirement phase and they're looking to decant out of their property and move somewhere else where they can get value, amenity, facilities and services and be closer to family, where are they going? They are looking at Springfield. These factors together are driving a profile that has been almost 7% population growth rate year on year for almost 20 years. At some point in time, once something happens for 20 years, you can't say it's a fluke anymore. There has to be a reason for that, an intention for that, a plan or a vision that's in behind that. And that's the story that already starts to resonate with people when I tell this in other places around the country. The other thing which was really interesting is that the socioeconomics, particularly regarding the incomes of the population within Springfield and the households within Springfield, has been above average, above the national average and above the state average pretty much from the beginning. Now, people misunderstand this figure and say that people in Springfield are rich. That's not what this says. What this says is people in Springfield work. There is a much higher proportion of 2-income households in Springfield and the greater project area than there is in most other parts of southeast Queensland and Queensland. People are more likely to enter the workforce while studying. People are more likely to enter the workforce and stay in the workforce while they are older. This is a place with a population that is economically engaged. And there is nothing is better in terms of the underlying socioeconomic profile of your population, of your community, than female workforce participation. Childcare is the most important economic policy we have in this country. Because the more women who are in work correlates to higher socioeconomic status. And it has been the case now for over 20 years. So when we look at things like schools investment, childcare investment, investments in childhood health, they are not social policies, they are economic development policies. When we look at the number of schools here, the number of childcare centres here, they are here for a reason. It's because the household finances and the overall socioeconomic status of households is as much dependent on the quality of the jobs as it is as many people in the households being actively engaged in the workforce. When we talk about economic engagement, I think it's hard to understate how challenging the labour market is going to be for businesses over the next decade. COVID has accelerated the withdrawal of the older elements of the baby boomer generation from the workforce within the element probably 3 to 7 years earlier than we otherwise were expecting. At the same time, the population that is coming through in terms of the younger population, the skills that they have and the experiences they have don't necessarily align with a lot of the jobs that are being decanted and vacated by an older population. There's an entire training exercise that needs to be undertaken from a business community perspective in a decentralised way for your business about engaging with people, with young people in schools, in universities and TAFEs while they're still students to start building a workforce for the future. Because at the moment, we have 500,000 people shortfall in our labour force. Within the course of the next decade, it will likely raise to 800,000 people of a shortfall in our workforce. So when we look at unemployment rates of 3%, that's the norm now. Anybody who can be economically engaged will have an increasingly strong incentive through wages, through economic policies to be part of the workforce. What that means, however, is that if you're growing a business and you're trying to attract investment to a region, you want to go where the workers are. And one of the interesting things that we've seen in Springfield, which include, in this case, including the adjacent Bellbird Park, is the sheer size of the growth of the workforce in the region over the last 7 years. 44% growth in 7 years in the size of the labour force within this region. You compare that to the national average of an 18% growth. Again, almost 3 times the growth in the labour force. So if you're entering a labour-constrained economics environment going forward and your number one constraint on your business is going to be access to skilled labour, where are you going to want to go? Somewhere centrally, where it's increasingly difficult to access due to congestion, and the size of the labour pool that can access the CBD is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and telecommuting is making it less and less attractive to do so? Or are you going to go to where the people are and offer a work-life balance, lifestyle and productive approach to running a business and hiring people? This story is not new though for Springfield. The environment in which Springfield is operating in terms of businesses and the global environment, that has changed. But Springfield has been an economically engaged population cohort with low unemployment from pretty much the get-go. The unemployment rate in the Springfield area has basically remained between 3 and 4% in perpetuity. We saw a jump during the period of time as associated with the restrictions associated with the pandemic, and scarily, the unemployment rate within Springfield got above 5%. I say that scarily because I work in a lot of places where it hit 20%. So what that shows is a level of economic, social, and environmental resilience in your labour market. And that's really important. If you're looking to grow a business and you're looking to plan for your business going forward into the future, and you're looking for things like skilled workers, succession planning, these types of issues, what that points to is a labour force that is resilient, a labour force that is skilled because they're less likely to be impacted by external shocks, and a labour force that is economically engaged. They're looking to work. And that's a really, really important driver and attribute of the region going forward. On the business front, over the last 5 years to 2021, there was some significant employment growth within the region. About 2.5, almost 3,000 jobs were added to the 3 areas. So to put it in context of the 15,000 job target, 20% of that was done in the last 5 years. Significant employment growth in such a short period of time. And to put that in context, it was off a base of 8,000 jobs. One of the interesting tales that came out of, and stories that came out of the census was the intensification of employment opportunities and jobs within Springfield relative to its population growth. I worked in Brisbane City Council in the year in which the rates base in Brisbane City Council from commercial overtook residential for the first time. And from an organisational fiscal perspective, it did their head in, because most councils are residential rate base. And all of a sudden, Brisbane City Council, the largest local government in Australia, all of a sudden had a primarily commercial rate base. It fundamentally changes the way you look at a location when the drivers of that location's prosperity, growth, and dynamism is economic, not just demographic. We're reaching a point now in Springfield where that tipping point from a demographic story to an economic story is taking place. And when that happens, the entire decision-making framework around where to locate, where to invest, how to grow, what your drivers are, changes. Because you become a destination for employment and population and labour and jobs, rather than being a net exporter of labour to other markets and other locations within Southeast Queensland. One of the things that's been really interesting we saw in the census, which happened in 2021, so it was in the middle of when Queensland was doing bloody good, but there was still a lot of restrictions around the place, was that the number of jobs that were located in Springfield as a share started to tick up a little bit more. We started to get an increase in employment that was located here, not just being located, people living here and driving out, to the point where it went from about 16.5% to over 18% of jobs of people who are employed, who live in Springfield, have their job also in Springfield. Interestingly enough, the next 2 locations, Southwest Industrial Gateway, just down the road here, a little bit further down the road when you get to like the Willawong, Wacol, that industrial area there, that's the second largest. It's also, interestingly enough, the second highest value-add industrial precinct in the whole of Queensland outside of the Australian trade coast. And then inner Brisbane. So what's interesting is we saw the employment intensifying locally, but also increased investment in infrastructure and improving the connectivity of this location to other parts of the southeast Queensland and back into Brisbane, also yielding benefits when it came to job access for local workers. The other two of note is Rosewood, Amberley Air Base. I always get that one pops up every morning. I'm there. That's why, because of Amberley Air Base. We haven't really even seen the impact of the Amberley Super Base project yet. We do know that the area is already a residential preference location for Defence Housing Australia. And we already know that Defence personnel and their families already make up a disproportionately large share of the population here compared to averages across the state. That's going to get even more intensive as we go forward, especially if we start factoring in supply chains. And the amount of money that is going into defence and the amount of desire to onshore defence activity, it's a huge opportunity for Springfield. I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. The other one of Ipswich Central is almost exclusively health. So this is the people who are living in this area and then are travelling into Ipswich Central for their health jobs. One of the greatest advantages that the new Mater Public Hospital has is they already have a public health workforce that lives here, and all of a sudden their commute goes from 20 minutes back into Ipswich to 0 minutes here in Springfield. And labour force planning is a really, really important thing when you come to hospital planning, and that concentration of health workers who live here but travel elsewhere for their employment, that's a big driver of why that investment is taking place and why further health investment is expected to take place in the future. The business registration story has been an absolute boon for the Springfield market and the Springfield region. Just as we saw that increase in employment locally, the reason for that is not because of public sector employment, it's because of the number of businesses that have been created over the last 3 to 4 years. Looking at the figure over the last 4 years, there has been a 36% growth in the number of businesses with their registered address here in Springfield from 2019 to 2022. It's just 3 years. 12% per annum. Talked earlier about that population growth I mentioned of 7% per annum. You got a 12% business growth year on year. This is the economic tipping point I was talking to you about. The economy is growing faster than the population, even though the population is growing 4 times faster than the state average. There's multiple drivers that are starting to realise here at the same time. When we look at the industries, the other one that really jumps out at me is that wheel of all the different types of industries is nice and even, almost like they're perfectly equidistant spokes on the wheel. What that means is that there are a lot of businesses in a lot of different industries here in Springfield. There's no one of them has just a ginormous chunk that counts for 40, 50%. There's lots of different industries, which means there are lots of opportunities and there's a diversity in the business community. So if an external shock happens, i.e. the pandemic, it's less likely to impact a large space, a large share of your labour force, of your business community, of your economic activity. You want that diversity because that diversity gives you resilience and security going forward. It also gives you the ability to pick winners. Because if one of these industries takes off all of a sudden, you've got exposure to it. If another industry dies down, you've got other industries that exist to help cushion that change. And we are expecting a lot of change in the economy over the next decade. We are genuinely not sure what happens to China now. And there's been a lot of economic activity that has taken place over the last 2 decades that has been linked to China. And we honestly don't know if that's going to be here in a decade, and we don't know what that looks like when it unwinds. So if you're in the Pilbara and you sell iron ore to build cities in China, it's not a good story. If you're in Springfield and you have access to a diverse range of businesses and exposure to a diverse range of industries, much, much more attractive, much more resilient environment to be in going forward. So when we drill down then into some clusters of economic activity and economic and business environment, we can see that there is a significant health cluster that is emerging within the area, and that's increasingly being driven not just by population here, but population in the surrounding area. The retail and entertainment space continues to build in sophistication, and the offering is moving away from a solely sort of supermarket-based population servicing into a lot more of the cafe, restaurant, tavern, a hotel type of offerings as it becomes more sophisticated. The money that's associated with that sector goes just from a residential to a residential and a commercial driver. The school and education space, I don't think we can understate how unique it is for a region or a location to have a major university's presence as early as it did in Springfield. We're seeing the lessons that have been learnt from Springfield being replicated in places like Petrie and North Lakes with the Mills site, or in places like in the southern areas of the Gold Coast, where the population growth outpaced the attraction of these tertiary educations. And it's a really hard behaviour to unwind. If people are used to leaving your location to go somewhere else for jobs, retail, work, whatever it might be, even when you put that thing in place and you improve the transport infrastructure, it takes generations to unwind the behaviours that you've already embedded. So we can't overstate how important that university and education sector is. I mentioned before the defence exposure, which hasn't really even realised yet in terms of, not just in terms of direct defence personnel, but also those supply chains in the contractor space. The professional services technology sector, which has been one of the biggest drivers of both employment growth and business growth over the last few years, as people who previously were hopping in a car or hopping on the train and going into inner Brisbane went through the pandemic and went, hey, I can do that here from home. I can set up my business locally. I know a few of them. I'm one of them. And so that has changed the nature of the business community in the location in such a short period of time. And then sport and recreation. A few years ago when I did this presentation, I'd be talking about the regionally significant sporting facilities of the area and what that means in terms of events and carnivals and people coming from outside of the region. Now we add the AFL to that, and the stadium, and the forecast when it comes to the Olympics as well. And those opportunities have suddenly gone from being regionally significant to nationally and globally significant as well, where other parts of Southeast Queensland are feverishly trying to compete for the potential to have some minor exposure to the Olympics. And then Springfield has this opportunity through the facilities and through the centrality, through the accessibility, to be able to leverage that in a much more ready way. And I needed to put some pictures just to break up all the charts to keep you interested, so that's why that slide's there. So one of the things I work with Springfield City Group, health departments, education providers, community service providers around trying to develop projections going forward around population growth. The population projections that have been produced by the state government in the region for Springfield have been consistently under what the actual growth has been. And of course that makes sense. Like as a public servant who's a demographer who's projecting things, this story, if it hadn't have already happened, is ridiculous. You would never project 7% year-on-year growth for a population centre. You just wouldn't do it. You'd be laughed at if you presented that to your colleagues and peers. But the reality is that that's what's happened already. And so the forward growth profile, as it moves not just from within the project area, but the growth areas that are being emulated and expanded outside of the project area, presents a significant opportunity going forward. And so that's what we did recently. We started to look at the project, not just from the specific Springfield area, those 3 statistical areas I mentioned before, covering the suburbs of Springfield, Springfield Lakes, Springfield Central, Augustine Heights, Brookwater, and Spring Mountain, but also the surrounding areas, following the Centenary Highway out to past Ripley and through to Deebing Heights, where the predominant travel flow, 80% of the travel flow, is back to Springfield and not into Ipswich as a continuation of that corridor. Looking at the investment that's happening at the moment, much to everybody's momentary chagrin, of the Springfield Greenbank Arterial and all the challenges that driving on a road with roadworks presents. My kids go to Springfield Anglican. Is that investment is increasing the accessibility to an entire growth front that extends all the way down to Flagstone, one of the state government's priority development areas. And then if you go to the north, you've got suburbs of Camira and Bellbird Park, both of which are hanging on to the side of the project in terms of their drivers. And then further in along the Centenary Highway back into Brisbane, to the Southwest Industrial Gateway precinct areas that I mentioned previously. One of the things we wanted to do whenever we do projections is we try to benchmark And it's bloody hard because, as I mentioned already, it's a relatively unique place. So trying to find benchmarks or comparable locations to do case studies is really, really difficult. We try to rely more on what was happening in terms of the role and function that the state government through the SEQ regional plan envisages that of Springfield. And that's for a principal activity precinct, a principal activity centre, which is basically, it is the highest rated, highest ranking activity centre outside of the Brisbane CBD within Southeast Queensland. And there's a number of them spread all over Southeast Queensland and in the greater Brisbane area, and Springfield is one of them. So we went and looked at comparable locations around the country that fulfilled those same sort of roles. University, major hospital precinct, population thresholds, skills levels, amenity locations. Tried to find locations that we had some comparison with and then get an understanding of what does their centre look like? What does their local area, what does their surrounding catchment look like? And what does that wider corridor look like in terms of the size and scale and calibre of the population? And the three locations we looked at with North Lakes, Joondalup in Western Australia and Dandenong in the Greater Dandenong area in the southeast of Melbourne. What you'll notice is that based on the 2021 census, pretty comparable local populations, pretty similar in terms of what's in the local area. Then the story changes. Joondalup is a slightly more mature location. Dandenong is a much more mature location. These provide some insights as to what the potential direction of those next look catchments are starting to look like. We can see the population of the greater North Lakes and Greater Springfield areas, not dissimilar, but both of them are half to 40% of that of the greater population of Dandenong and the greater population of Joondalup. Then we look going forward into the future to the wider corridor even, the extended area outside of the local, the greater region or the greater catchment, and you can start seeing the difference in the population becomes even more stark. 145 for Springfield, 500,000 people within the corridor catchment of Greater Dandenong, 370,000 within the greater population of, within the population of the corridor of Joondalup. What that gives us is an idea of the critical mass and direction of the population going forward in terms of the size and scale that Springfield is potentially going to have to service as a principal activity centre. And so from that, we looked at a series of different data sets, including the state government's population projections, which were based on the 2016 census. If you hadn't guessed, a lot's happened since 2016. We've also looked at a number of different data sets regarding sort of residential land releases, major project announcements from a state government as well as the private sector, and developed a set of population projections that started to give an indication of where the region is going over the next 20 years. So as you would expect, the largest share of the growth going forward of the population that this location is going to service is in those greater and corridor-wide catchments that we saw earlier. The blue, which is the greater growth corridor, is expected to reach over 400,000, approximately 435,000 people by 2041. That includes the exposure to the priority development areas in Ripley. That includes exposure to areas such as in through Greenbank and Everleigh development, as well as through North Maclean and down into Flagstone. Significant population growth areas that are expected to generate very large populations that are then also expected to be flowing to Springfield for employment, service access, jobs, business activity. Just to put that in context, that is a slowing of the growth of the region. Obviously off a larger base, but it's a population dropping to about 5.6% per annum year on year. So as much as it sounds ridiculous, this is potentially conservative. And we need to do that as demographers to be a little bit more conservative, but you don't want to go so far that you undercook the numbers so much that people make decisions based on a future that's unlikely to happen. And so these numbers here, as I said, is a slowing of the growth of the region over the next 20 years. Where is this population expected to go? Well, as you would expect, its exposure to those priority development areas very close to Springfield in through the Ripley Valley area and then down through into Greenbank, North Maclean and the northern parts of Flagstone. So this is the population here in blue of where the concentration of people are at the moment. The green is where the concentration of population is going to be in the future. This includes an intensification of the population within Springfield too, given the existing approvals and the plans associated with apartment building and increased density within Springfield itself, particularly Springfield Central. And so if we just look at the growth, you're looking at an additional 230,000 people within the corridor as a whole, as really the primary catchment of the principal activity centre of Springfield by 2041. The scale of the growth means that the region, Springfield specifically, and the wider region will continue to be a destination of choice and a preferential destination for new people who call Queensland home. These are new migrants from interstate. These are new migrants from overseas. These are people from other parts of southeast Queensland who are looking to travel to somewhere with schools, hospitals, universities, public open space, regionally significant retail, business opportunities, job opportunities, sport and recreation facilities. There's not many places you can point to in southeast Queensland as other preferential locations that you can point to and say, yes, that place has all of those things. And that is a perfect example of what it is to create your own amenity. This place is not on the coast. This doesn't have the benefit of that amazing coastline. What it does have is everything else. Amenity and lifestyle are inherently subjective things. There's a survey done by Ipsos on a biannual basis that looks at quality of living and lifestyle amenities around the country. And one of the things that they do very actively is they list out 20 indicators and they do not allocate any weighting to them as to what constitutes livability. Because what you think is livability is going to be different to what you think is livability and what I think is livability. What you can do if you manufacture, you create, and you foster and you grow your livability is you can appeal to a much wider audience than those who just like to go to the beach every day. Huge, huge advantage for Springfield and for the region going forward into the future. One of the interesting things, as I mentioned earlier, about maintaining a young population is that because of the economic activity here, the population is expected to remain relatively robust and young going forward into the future. And that's the university has a huge role to play in that because it's the attraction and the retention of students who act as your local domestic production of young workers and new workers for this environment and for the business environment going forward into the future. That doesn't mean that the size of the population who is older and age 65 plus isn't going to increase. It's going to increase by a lot. It has to because the population is increasing by a lot in the region. What it does mean, however, is that unlike a lot of other locations where the size of the ageing burden is going to get so great it crowds out all other activity, that is not expected to take place here in Springfield. Springfield is expected to continue to have economic activity above and beyond that which is required to support an increasing older population. And there are very few locations in southeast Queensland, let alone Australia, that can point to that. So again, if you're a business, if you're an investor and you're looking to go somewhere, why are you going to go to somewhere where you're immediately entering a location where you have an older population burden on your economy, on your community, on your facilities and services? Or are you going to pick a location where you can have a much more dynamic business, employment and investment environment that's generating wealth to help maintain an older population as they exit the workforce? You're going to pick the latter. Many of you already have. So what this means going forward into the future in terms of opportunities. I do a lot of futurism stuff. Most of my futurism work that I do tends to be for banks pointing out things that they don't want to hear. And that's the point of it. The point of it is to pick out those things where you're trying to go against conventional wisdom. Things like tech rejection. Excuse me, there you go, it even heard me. Tech rejection. What happens if the population turns against things like social media, things like online activities and commercial and wants to return to a pre-social media environment? What happens then when you have all these businesses that have been built around things like social media and e-commerce? What happens when you have other trends that are happening around agriculture and food security, where all of a sudden industries that haven't been as attractive or exciting all of a sudden are of fundamental national security importance? What happens when conventional trade routes and partners that we've relied on for 20, 30 years disappear and potentially violently disappear? What happens? I'm lucky here that I don't need to really do a lot of fear-mongering because the story here is backed by a 20-year trend of where it has been, and it's a 20-year trend of where it is continuing to go. One of the big drivers, as I mentioned before, is around skills and skills attraction. That is the number one driver of competitive advantage going forward in the future. Do you have people who can work? Do you have the skills to support my business? That is what people want to know. I do a lot of work with EOIs and for businesses looking to relocate and position, and it is the number one thing that they want to know. Who is your workforce? What skills do they have? Who can I partner with to develop more skills? Because that is going to impact their productivity and their ability to do business going forward in the future. Springfield has those skills. Defence, as I said, hasn't even really eventuated yet, hasn't realised yet, but the scale and size of the investment in the defence sector and in the supply chains in the defence sector and onshoring as much as that is possible is going to be a major opportunity for the principal activity centre that is one of the closest to one of the largest defence bases within the Southern Hemisphere, that of Amberley. The Olympics is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. It's a once-in-a-generation opportunity for a bunch of eyeballs who have never heard of Springfield to have a look at Springfield. Don't underestimate the long-term intergenerational impact that a bunch of people who have never been to Springfield before, never been to Queensland before, never been to Australia before, walking into your precinct and then having them go away and telling somebody that they know in their network about this place they went to in Australia. Sometimes the payoff for these things is long, but it also compounds and it's significant. And it's right up there in scale with things like international education. We know one of the biggest returns from international education is from multi-generational investment attraction. The Olympics represents another way of doing that and another way of Springfield for getting exposure and being really taking its place as that nationally significant master plan community. The health investment, the dedicated nature of the health city precinct and the investment that's already taken place from MARTA and increased investment now from the state government will continue to grow. And it will continue to grow not off the back of an ageing population or a flat and ageing population, but of the increasingly demanding needs of a very large population within the surrounding catchment of this precinct. Health is different, however, to hospitals. Hospitals are one part of health. What happens to all the other health services that are required, all the allied health, all the mental health, all the services that are provided not in a hospital, but in all of the other types of health facilities that exist and health offerings? Huge opportunity, huge need going forward into the future. The tunnels in Brisbane were basically designed for Springfield. As somebody who hops on a plane a lot, it is amazing. I love it. Do not underestimate the fact that you can get to the airport without a set of traffic lights in under 40 minutes through 2 tunnels in terms of your proximity. Just don't do it in peak time. Don't underestimate how important that is. People will look at a map and go, oh, airport over there, Springfield over here. Highlighting that accessibility is really, really important because what it does is it expands as businesses your customer base and it expands, more importantly, your labour pool. As your number one constraint going forward, it makes your labour pool even bigger than that map I showed you before. The capital of the region. A capital city is one that is the concentration of both population and economic activity. Springfield has reached a point where it is now and should be regarded as a capital of this region. And as a result of that, and as a result of the reaching that tipping point of where the economics and commercial are as much of a driver of growth here as the population and demographics, the nature of this region, its economic activity, and how it projects that out to the world becomes really, really important and really important distinction compared to other locations that could be attracting investment. This is a place to come to do business for the entirety southern part of southeast Queensland, not just a place to come and live, hop in a car and drive somewhere else. Because there are a lot of those places in southeast Queensland. The other one, which is really interesting, and again, we need to really go back to the intentions and the design of the project from the very beginning, and that is housing choice. Housing affordability has been a huge issue and will be a huge issue going forward in the future because the number of households with 2 incomes is going to keep going up and up and up. And that just inherently builds purchasing power capacity. and it inherently builds into the ability of households to choose home ownership over renting and other forms of tenure. One of the interesting things here, and one of the things that distinguishes it from other locations around the country, is the fact that density was envisaged here from the beginning. The open space is here, the facilities are here, the infrastructure is here, the services are here, and all put in place envisaging a level of residential density in that core of the Springfield Central area. That was envisaged from the beginning and planned from the beginning. It's not an afterthought by a developer who's seen the prices go up and can now cut the land because of the feasibility of apartments now stacks. And that's usually how we get non-inner city urban development, is the prices just run away and you can justify the land, cutting up the land for apartments over houses. That's not what happens here. This is by design. The density was here by design. That population I showed you before in the Springfield is a reflection of that residential density, that residential housing choice being in place through the vision of the master plan and by design. And I can't think of anything better to end this conversation and this presentation on by highlighting the importance of a vision. As I said, I've worked in a lot of places around the country. I work with a lot of people around the country. And one of the challenges is always fragmented landowners, a lack of vision that extends beyond how many lots can I sell this year? You know, how do I get the government to pay for this road? So all my people who live here from the lots that I've sold can get in their car and travel to somewhere else because their job's elsewhere is somebody else's problem. I can't overstate, how important it is to know that this has been by design and by intention, not by accident. And that is a competitive advantage that other regions around the state and other regions around the country cannot replicate. Because it was decisions made 30 years ago, not decisions made now, that have resulted in this growth profile and these drivers, these diverse drivers being in place right now. Thank you very much.